Now that we have an application, or at least part of an application, we can now start to think about testing. We can indeed build tests before we build any of our code, so a test first approach, or we can test after. Now, as I'm assuming that everyone here is generally new to Django and maybe Python development, we are going to test after, generally in this course, after we develop some of our code or part of our application. We focus here on testing models. So the idea here is that we want to build tests based upon maybe some of the decisions or maybe some of the features that we've included in our model. What we don't want to do is test something that's already been tested. Now, if we consider the fact that the Django framework is fully tested, we don't want to test something that is a feature of Django. We're trying to look for features of our application that we have developed or maybe specified. So if we take a look at this model here, we can see that we have specified max lengths for title and subtitle. So it might be, if this was maybe a particular case where you had to make sure that the max length was, say, 10 characters, and it couldn't be anything less, couldn't be anything more, then maybe that is a reason to test that particular field. Because what you don't want to happen maybe is another developer is developing your application and changes the max length to, say, 11 characters instead, because the part of the application that they developed required 11 characters. So maybe a test is warranted there because you have specifically specified, get rid of that, you have specifically specified 11 characters, say here, for example, or 10 characters. You might want to make a test for that. So here we have this unique property. So maybe we want to test for that. Coming down, so we're just basically looking for where we've created some changes in our application and where that then relates and is important to ensure that our application works successfully. If we move down the bottom here, something that we have here, this dunderstring method here, we've specifically specified that we want to return objects and give it this name here, the title. So that's our dunderstring return. So we might want to test that to make sure that is happening correctly. Again, we might not do that because that isn't necessarily going to be a feature of our application potentially. But if it is important, then, and it is a feature of our application that we depend on, then we ought to maybe test for it. So I am trying to avoid any specifics here because I am very much treading on eggshells when it comes to what to test. But hopefully I'm giving you a general overview and a starter point. What to test? Well, we need to test important aspects of our code that our application is dependent upon. So if our application depends on, for example, this piece of code here to work down here, otherwise our application wouldn't work correctly, then we probably need to test to make sure that works as intended. So we are essentially just testing to ensure that what we've written here, that our code works as intended. Right, so on the left-hand side here, we can see in the blogs, Django provides our test file here, and we can make a folder here. That is very common to make a folder inside of our app that we are running tests on or relating tests to. But we obviously have decided, or I've decided at the start of this project, that we're going to add all the tests inside of this test folder here. So what we're going to do in the test folder is we're going to create a new folder. I'm going to call that blog, and that's obviously going to represent this app here. So I am going to place all my tests inside of a folder which is related to an app. So this folder here is related to my app in terms of the name. So let's go inside of here and let's create a new file. Now we are going to want to probably call this as a module. So let's go for our dunder init py. Let's add one of those in there. And then let's make a new file. So inside of blog here, we are going to be testing models. So it seems like a good idea to always try and name files related to what it is we expect to find in that file in terms of what tests. So let's create a new file here. Now we need to name our file test underscore, remember, then something. So let's just call this models, test models. So that clearly identifies, in my opinion, what it is we're going to find in this file. So if we are stuck in regards to what to test, if you're not too sure, and that's likely at the start of testing, it's always a bit tricky to understand exactly what needs to be tested. We can be guided. There are applications or software that can help us. So let's just close this server and clear that. So PyTest has some built-in tools. So for example, if we type in PyTest and then cov, oh, that's not going to work. Command not found PyTest. It doesn't look like we have PyTest installed. Maybe that's the first thing that we need to do here. So let's go ahead and install, because I think we forgot to install it or to add it. What's going on here? We forgot to add it, I think, in the requirements previously. So I think we need to do that again. Okay, so let's go ahead and install Django PyTest. PyTest Django 4.5.2. Doesn't matter if it's a later version, not a problem. So pip install this application if you haven't already done so. Now remember, we forgot to do this because previously when we moved everything over to our GitHub repository, we forgot to add that in our requirements text. So that's why we need to install that again. You may not need to. You can see that I've already installed it. So with that done, let's just make sure that we pip freeze and add that to our requirements file. Now remember, this requirements file is, I think it's outside of our project, isn't it? Yep, so we need to change directory. It's a bit of a pain. And go back up one, we've got our requirements there. So let's just pip freeze and then requirements. And then just go back, cd back into our djblogger. There we go. So it can be difficult at the start of testing to understand what it is that needs to be tested. So we can use coverage, which is essentially going to scan our application, our code, and determine where tests might be needed. So let's just give this a go. Inside of, again, back into PyPy, let's go ahead and install PyTest, PyTest coverage. Oh, just go directly to it. So PyTest Cov 4.0.0. So let's install this as well. Let's give this a go. I should have waited before moving back into that folder, shouldn't I, to update. So with that installed, I think that's all we're going to need at this point. So let's change directory again, back into our directory with our requirements file. Let's just pip freeze. We should be able to pip freeze. And then let's go back into our folder again, djblogger. Okay, so with that done, let's PyTest. And now let's say --cov. So that's going to run coverage. And you can see here, that's going to give us an indication where tests are needed. So there's one missing test here in our blog models. And that's pretty much it. We've just got one missing test. So that's going to give us an indication. And it's not going to be exact always, as our code gets a little bit more complex, but it's going to give us an indication. And we can turn this into almost a game. We're trying to make sure that we're making tests to cover everywhere where this is suggesting a test is needed. Now, this isn't exactly the best information. We do have one missed test, but that isn't necessarily going to tell us, it's not telling us at this point exactly what needs to be tested. So we can get deeper here and we can get some more specific information. So we can do that utilizing coverage again. So we need to make a report. So what we can do now is we can generate a report. So let's go into PyTest again, --cov. And then we need to specify we're going to build a report. And there are a few different reports that we can generate, but we're going to generate a web report. And that's going to allow us to delve into the different tests that might need to be created. And once we've done that, we need to specify where we're going to place these new files. So let's say cov, --cov equals /. So we're going to just place it here. So let's go ahead. And you can now see in our project, we should have a new folder called HTML_cov. So that goes into our root directory where our manage.py resides. So we do want to keep that. So we're probably going to need to in git ignore to just make sure that we ignore that folder. So HTML_cov. So let's make sure we update our git ignore file to ignore this. And now what we can do is we can inspect it. So there should be an index file here. So we can open that reveal that in our Explorer window. And then we can open that up with our default browser. So we now have something that looks a little bit like this. Okay, so now what we can do is we can drill down. So we've got a few different missing here. So it looks like we've got something missing here in our models. So let's take a look. And you can see what it looks like is missing is we need to test this function here. So let's go back and run PyTest cov again. And you can see that it only found one problem. But notice that when we create our HTML, there's a whole load of other issues that is created here. So, or missing tests. But these are all tests that we don't necessarily need to perform. For example, here in the manage.py, this is all Django code. So we don't necessarily need to test this. So let's just go with what we've got here. So we've identified in the models that there is a test missing. So let's grab our models and we can see inside here, it looks like we're going to need to test this function that we created. We're going to test and make sure that it returns the title. So now having identified what test we need to actually create, we need a test to basically run this code and to make sure that what is being returned here is what is expected to be returned, the title of the object that we're trying to extract maybe from our database. So in order to run this test, we need to think about how we're going to do this. Well, in order to run this test here to make sure that something is returned from our database and the $string return is the title of the actual object that's being returned, we're going to need to, in our testing environment, we're going to need to create our database. We're going to need to add some data into our database and return it, and then inspect that data to make sure that the data is returned or the $string method is being used. So typically when we are testing tables, databases, we're going to need some data. Now what we can do in every single test is we can create some data for that particular test. But that isn't always the best way of working. So we want to potentially have hundreds of tests, and those hundreds of tests will most probably require our database, because in Django here, everything resides, or all our data resides in our database, and pretty much every feature or function that we generate or build is going to need data from our database. So we're going to need to, when we build tests, build data or prepare data before we run the tests. So we're going to create some factories, which are essentially pieces of code which we can reuse whenever we run tests that require data in our database. So let's go into our tests here in the root directory, and we're going to create a new file called factories.py. So inside of here, we're going to build some factories. Now, there are two common tools here to do this, and we've decided to utilize Factory Boy in this tutorial series. So we're going to need to install Factory Boy. I think that's going to be the first step. So let's type in Factory Boy, py. Here we go. So let's go ahead and pip install Factory Boy. This is going to help us generate data, and it's going to create factories. So factory being something that we can call in our code, and it generates a number of different entries in our database. So let's get back into our terminal here. Just clear that. Let's pip install Factory Boy. Okay, we're going to need to save that, aren't we? Let's just cd / or cd space // to come up to the root where the requirements are. Let's just make sure we pip freeze and update our requirements text so everything's up to date, and then cd back into our project folder. Okay, so with that done, let's now start thinking about factories. Right, so first of all, let's import factory. So again, what we're going to be doing here, we're going to be essentially preparing some code, which is going to be inserting data into our database whenever we run our test. So import factory. So we're going to need, in this case, we're going to need our tables. So let's bring in Django .contrib.auth.models. Yeah, import user. Okay, so we've got our user model. We're going to need that. And then from our blog, so from djblogger.blog.models, let's go ahead and import what we got, a post. Okay, so those are our models that we're going to need. Okay, so let's go ahead now and create a new factory. So we're going to call this factory a user factory. Oh, let's create our post factory first, and that will make more sense. So let's create this post factory. So factory dot Django. So Factory Boy does come with some specific Django tools. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the Django model factory. And what that means is that we can use all the information that's already been written about our model. We can utilize that to determine what data to create. So let's go ahead and say class meta. So we specify the model that we're using equals post. There we go. And then we can start to now build some data for this post model. So let's go split screen. And we're bringing our models over here so we can see what we're doing. Just close that. So we're going to need a few different things here. So we've got titles. So we need a title. So let's just say for now, title equals X. We'll change this in a minute. So title equals X, subtitle equals. So we need to make sure that we're careful to ensure that we have included all the mandatory fields that are required. So slug equals X. So we've got slug, the author. Now this is a foreign key, so we're going to need to do something specific here. And this is why I was going to create an additional factory first. So in actual fact, we're going to need to build, well, we don't, but let's build a new factory because we can't connect our post. We can't create a post unless there is a foreign key, unless we actually have an author. So anytime we actually create a new post, we are going to need to create a new author. So this is why we're going to build a new factory here called user factory. So this is a factory.django model. Okay, let's bring this across a bit so you can see. So what we're going to do here is just say class meta model equals user. And then we just need to remember what fields there are. So I'll just tell you, password equals test. So we're going to need to set up a password. We're going to need, or username and password, doesn't matter which order, test. And then we need to define whether they're a super user or not. Is super user equals, let's just make a super user. And then we're also going to need to sign is staff. Equals true. Okay, there we go. So if we go into your Explorer here, you can check out the fields. Of course you can. If you go into your database, right click, open the database up, we can, oh sorry, down here. Sorry, open up our database, refresh, go to users, show table. We can see that this table has a number of different fields. So you can just follow the fields if you like. So we've set up the username and password. Email is not required. Last name is not required. Is staff is active is required. This date joined is going to be generated and the first name is not required. Right. So that's nicely set up. So what we can do now is we can connect our post factory model here to our author or to our user model in this case. So we just say factory.subfactory and then just specify the class. So user factory. There we go. Okay, so that's going to essentially, whenever we create a new post, it's going to fire off this factory. It's going to make that user and assign that user to the new post that's being created. Nice and simple. Right, so we don't need category. I don't know why I keep saying category. I've got it in my head. Category, content. So we need content equals, and then let's just add some data for now. Okay, right. So we could also set the status if we wanted to. So let's do that. Status. So there's two status, published and draft. So let's set this to published. Okay. So on the left-hand side is the option, on the right-hand side is what's seen in the drop-down. This is where it's got capitals. So these two here are what's seen in the drop-down, maybe in the admin area when we selected it. And this is the two options, draft and published, that's saved into the database. I don't think I mentioned that previously. Right, so we've got status. I think we're done there. I think we'll get told if that isn't the case. So we don't need created at or updated at. That will just get automatically created for us. Now that we have our factories, we are going to need to call them within our tests. We want to utilize them as part of our tests. So we're going to create the data and then run the test. So to do that, we are going to need some tools for that. So let's go back into the command prompt here, the terminal. Let's pip install. I think it's PyTest Factory Boy. Yep. Okay. So we're going to install PyTest Factory Boy. Good. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is one of the benefits of PyTest. There's lots of different add-ons, additions, extensions that we can install for it. So that's PyTest Factory Boy that we've just installed there. And that's going to give us the tools to kind of register and interact with Factory Boy within PyTest. So with that done, we need to add that, of course. I don't want to keep forgetting this. So cd, let's cd back out. Let's go and pip freeze. Hopefully, the more times we do it, more familiar you'll get with it. So cd dot back into our project. There we go. Clear that. So, right, let's now create a new file. So inside of our test folder, we're going to create a new file called conf test. So this file is going to be seen by PyTest or read by PyTest before it actually runs any tests. So what we want to do in this file is to create some setup. So this file can be found maybe in subfolders. Maybe if inside of our blog here, we wanted some specific setup for our blog tests, which are all going to be inside the blog folder, we can add a conf test file there as well. Okay, so from PyTest _ factory boy, we're going to go ahead and import register. So what we need to do is register our factories so that we can use them within our test. So from .factories, let's just bring them in. Let's import the two factories. I nearly said category there. I've just got it in my head, category, I don't know why. Because normally it's the first thing we do. So from factories, let's import factory, post factory, and then we can go ahead and just register it. So this will now become available, and we can now utilize our factory from within our test. Right, so with that done, let's go back into our blog and our tests. Now remember that one test was missing in coverage, and that was the dunder string function that we created. So the test flow here is that we're going to need to create a new object in the database, and then we're going to need to extract it out and then test to make sure that when we return that, it returns the dunder string of the object, which is going to be the title of that particular object. So that's the flow here. So let's go ahead and create a new class. So we're going to be working in classes here in our tests. The whole idea is that classes allow us to kind of bunch tests together, and it makes it easier for us to potentially, if we have hundreds of tests on the page, it can make it easier for us to identify whereabouts each test might be. So let's call this test. Going to start with test, and then this is going to be post model. So we're going to test the post model. All tests related to the model, post model, is going to be found here within this class. So let's create a new function. Let's call this test underscore. So it's always going to start with test something underscore, and we're going to test the string return. So we need taken self and then the post factory. So post factory, where does that come from? Well, what happens here when we register, when we register this post factory, we can then access the post factory in lowercase and then utilizing the underscore between post and factory. So that's the kind of format that's going to happen. If we would name this something else like category factory, for example, we're going to access it through register as category underscore factory lowercase. So that's how we're accessing our factory now. So we're connected to our factory. So what's going to happen now when we initiate this, what's going to happen is our factory is going to run. It's behind the scenes, it's going to add data to our test database. That's important. So when we run tests, we don't run tests on the actual database, our live database. Behind the scenes, when we build tests, Django is going to create a testing database, and that's going to be modeled based upon our models. So it's going to use this information, our models, to actually build that. And then once that's ready, it's then going to insert this data into both the post table and the user table in order to generate this new post. There's a lot going on, but we just need to line everything up. So what we need to do now is say post equals post underscore factory. So we're going to run this. Now what we can do is we can pass parameters to the factory. So if I wanted to override, for example, the title, in this case I do because I want to maybe control that, I can say test post. So that's going to generate and utilize this factory here, but it's going to override the title, whereas it would normally create X, where it's now going to return title test post. So now the understring method should return test post whenever I call this object from the database. So in actual fact, I don't need to call it. I can just now assert and then say post dot, and then just get the understring function. So I'm calling the understring function here. So if we go in the models, essentially what I'm doing here is I'm calling this function in the object, and then that's going to hopefully return the title. So go back to our tests here. So that should equal, well, that should equal whatever the title is. In this case, it's going to equal test post. Okay, and there's our first test. Right, so in order to run test, what we saw, I think, previously when we were practicing building tests in the previous section, we found out that in order to run tests, we're going to need access to the database, or the testing database. So we can utilize PyTest marks. In this case, I override or add to the PyTest mark. That's then going to be applied to all tests. So instead of me having to declarate maybe functions or assign and allow database access to individual tests, I just do a blanket setup here. And that means that all of the classes here in this test module, in this test file, will be able to access the database. So that's why I've set that up. Let's go ahead and import PyTest. We can add that. There we go. And there we have it. There's our first test. A little bit long-winded, but let's give this a go. So, what am I doing? So let's go ahead and type in PyTest. Give that a go. You can see that there's one error, which is all good. So what's going on here? So import error, attempted relative import, but with no known parent package. Okay. So I need to make sure, in order for me to import the factories, because the problem is here that we can't do a relative import, what we're going to need to do here is to make sure that we have an init file also inside of our test folder. It's playing up again. Init.py. There we go. So now when we run tests again, it should find the import. Yep, everything is fine. And you can see that we've now run 2 tests. So don't forget, we've got the example test here that we created in the first section, as well as now the new test that we've just built inside of our blogs. So everything is working successfully. Let's just try this out. A bit of sanity test here. Let's just change this to that, for example. So we're going to add this title, and we're going to then check this object for the understring return. And obviously that isn't going to match now. So if we run our tests, it should cause an error. And there we go. So let's just take a quick look. You can see that what should have been returned was, of course, what should be returned was the post X, and that's what was actually returned. So it does give you an indication in this test what potentially should have been returned, which is handy. And you can then find that error because it does give you some specific information, which is really quite useful. So now that we have our test completed, we want to now make sure that the coverage has been updated. So let's find our previous command if we can. There we go. So let's go ahead and run our coverage report again. So this is the command that we utilized. Okay, we're still failing. So let me just do that again, change the code. We are failing. So hopefully now when we go back into our, let's see if we can go back, maybe put it here. Here we go. So now that when we go back into coverage, as we did before, the models, so look at the models, you can see that there are no tests required. So going back in here, nothing's missing. Now we've tested this function.